Fourth Industrial Revolution, the new globalization, and the reforms needed to address the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This 2021, to follow through on last year's theme on innovating governance for the new normal, the DPRM is focusing on the theme Reset and Rebuild for a better Philippines in the post-pandemic world. Through this theme, we wish to emphasize that to rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic and create a better Philippines, we need to reset our paradigms and practices by balancing the interests of people, profit, and planet. This means placing equal importance on economic, social, and environmental well-being and sustainability. To make this possible, the government should set the right policies that will allow all citizens, regardless of status in life, to access essential public services and will protect all segments of the population, especially the poor and the vulnerable, from various risks through effective social protection systems. The business sector, for its part, should explore ways and areas where it can be both profitable and socially responsible. Business owners and operators should embrace decent work principles, provide the best service to their customers, and care for the well-being of their employees, the community, and the environment. Meanwhile, the civil society should continue reaching out to sectors that do not have access to government channels. It should also strengthen its advocacy for more accountable and responsive governance and more sustainable business practices. The academe also has an important role to play. It should ensure that the new modes of delivering education and training under the new normal are accessible to all and will not widen economic and social inequalities. As individual citizens, we also need to start living more responsibly by adopting more sustainable lifestyles. We should start the reset and rebuild agenda with ourselves to effectively influence others. Collectively, we all need to work together. The government, business sector, academe, civil society, and the general public should join forces in pursuing a shared vision of an equitable, sustainable, and resilient post-pandemic Philippines. Know more about the DPRM and how you can participate by visiting its website.
Dapat po munang alamin or matukoy ang pangunahing problema ng bansa upang mapagtuunan ng pansin at mabigyan ng solusyon.
We should have specific goals, do research, and make a policy that is fair for everyone.
Walang problema sa pulisiya. Iayos lang ang pagpapatupad.
Bago patubas ang batas, pag-aralan muna gusto ng government.
Two things, clarity and execution. Both, you need the communication and monitoring. As simple as that.
Mandato ng Philippine Institute for Development Studies o PIDS na gumawa ng mga pag-aaral at pananaliksik ng mga polisiya at programa ng pamahalaan at magbigay ng rekomendasyon sa mga mambabatas sa pagbabalangkas ng mga polisiyang makakatulong sa ating bansa. Sinusulong ng aming ahensya ang evidence-based policy making upang bigyan din ng kahalagahan ng polisiya na batay sa datos at policy research na sumusuri sa tunay na kalagayan ng ating mga komunidad. Napakahalaga ng policy research, lalo na sa mga panahong dumadaan sa krisis ang ating bansa.
Kapag polisiya ay pinag-aralan, susulong ang bayan.
Good morning. Good morning, Anton, Ben. How are you guys? Made
Well,
it.
thanks. Good morning.
Hi. Good. You made it, Anton. Did you get some sleep over?
Yes, can you hear me, Romy?
Yes, I hear you. We're already live in Facebook, Anton. So, saka na tayo magchismisan.
Okay.
Thank
I'll
you.
go back to mute.
Okay, me too. Thank you. Good morning, Secretary Karl. I sent earlier something if we need a musical intermission featuring a wonderful band.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Secretary Karl.
Morning, Mr. Secretary.
Good morning, Secretary.
Morning.
Pwede ng picturean. Diba? Dali lang. I'll show my face. Or we can send it to...
Welcome to the PIDS webinar series. Before we start the webinar, we would like to give you a few reminders. For attendees, your microphone is muted upon entry. In case you have a question, the moderator will read it during the open forum. For those attending via Cisco WebEx, use the chat box located at the lower part of the screen. Click the chat icon, type your name and affiliation and your question, and send to all panelists. You may send your questions while the presentation is in progress. The moderator will read them during the open forum. For Facebook viewers, at least 2 questions from the comment section will be read by the moderator during the open forum. We will moderate all questions to ensure that they are relevant to the scope of the presentation. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your active participation.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the opening program of the 7th Annual Public Policy Conference, or APPC, the highlight of the Development Policy Research Month, or DPRM. The DPRM is an annual event which we celebrate every September to underscore the importance of policy research in national development and nation building. The APPC convenes policy experts to analyze critical development issues and offer evidence-based policy recommendations and solutions. I am Sheila Siar, and I will be your MC. To formally open our program and tell us more about the APPC and this year's theme, may I call on Dr. Aniceto Orbeta Jr., President of PIDS.
Secretary of Planning, Socioeconomic Planning Secretary Karl Kendrick Chua, Mr. Romeo Bernardo, Professor Luigi Zingales, Mr. Antonio Periquet, Dr. Benito Tihanki, officials from various sectors, namely Department of Labor and Employment Undersecretary Benju Inavides, Department of Agrarian Reform Undersecretary Virginia Urugo, National Economic Development Authority Assistant Secretary Roderick Planta, Department of Labor and Employment Assistant Secretary Alex Avila, Department of Foreign Affairs Assistant Secretary Gina Hamuralin, Department of Foreign Affairs Assistant Secretary and Director General of the APEC Philippine National Secretariat Eric Tamayo, Department of Foreign Affairs Deputy Assistant Secretary Maria Luilia Duarte, Senate Planning Economic Office Director General Ronald Golding, Philippine Statistical Research and Planning Institute Executive Director Josefina Almeida, National Policy Commission Deputy Private Commissioner, Privacy Commissioner John Henry Naga, Senate Economic Planning Office Executive Director Merwin Salazar, House of Representatives Congressional Policy and Budget Research Department Director General Romeo Miral, Bangsamoro Development Agency OIC Director Razmi Talim, Directors, Assistant Directors, and other officials of the House of Representatives, the National Economic Development Authority, Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of the Interior and Local Government, the Philippine Information Agency, the Civil Service Commission, Department of Trade and Industry, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development, Board of Investment, Department of Energy, Securities and Exchange Commission, National Council of Disability Affairs, and other government agencies. From the PIDS board, we have Dr. Gilbert Llanto. From the private sector, besides our panelists, we have Minimal Government Thinkers President Benvenido Plus Jr. From the academy, let me acknowledge the following: Cagayan State University President Orduha Alvarado, Mountain Province State Political College President Rexton Chacas, University of San Carlos School of Business and Economics Dean Melanie Berzuela de Ocampo, UP Mindanao School of Management Dean Aurelia Luz Biminda Gomez, Notre Dame University Dean Ronald Mamaril, Aklan State University Dean Benedict Bombais, De La Salle University Dean Marites Tionco, University of the Philippines School of Business Dean Joel Tan Torres, Pamantasan ng Kabuya Vice President for Research and Extension Virginia Bautista, Directors, Assistant and Deputy Directors of various colleges and universities such as the Miriam College, University of San Carlos, University of Science and Technology of Southern Philippines, Bicol, Central Bicol State University of Agriculture, Polytechnic University, University of Visayas, Mindanao Center of Policy Studies, and all school representatives who are here with us this morning. From the CSOs, NGOs, and INGOs, we have Embassy of Republic of Singapore in Manila, First Secretary Wang Zi, Philippine Embassy in Paris, First Secretary Consul Christina McKernan, World Bank Senior Economist Kevin Chua, Institute of Corporate Affairs Directors Trustee Alfredo Pascual, Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy President Almina Rasol Bernardo, PhilCode Program Director Jamil Raton, Masaganang Sakahan Director Daniel Agustin, Small Enterprise Research and Development Foundation Trustee Tunig Calinos, and also our friends from the media. Good morning to you all. Let me also welcome all as well our viewers on the PIDS and SERPI Facebook pages and the social media pages of the Radio Television Malacanang or RTVM. Thank you, RTVM, for accommodating our requests. Each year, we select a theme for the Development Policy Research Month celebration from a wide range of emerging issues that require attention of policymakers, stakeholders, and the general public. For 2021, we choose the theme Reset and Rebuild for a Better Philippines in the Post-Pandemic World, or in Filipino, muling magsimula at magtayo tungo sa mas matatag na Pilipinas pagkatapos ng pandemya, to highlight the need to rebuild our from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic by resetting our paradigms and practices so that we can move forward from this crisis and be resilient in the face of future challenges. We have witnessed the devastating and far-reaching impacts of the pandemic that's led to business closures and job losses, which consequently increased poverty incidence and widened inequalities in our country and across the world. The blog published by the World Bank in June this year, it was mentioned that the increase in poverty that occurred in 2020 due to the pandemic still lingers, and that the COVID-induced poor in 2021 is around 97 million people globally. In the Philippines, a PIDS study released in 2020 predicted that the number of poor Filipinos could rise by about 1.5 million from the baseline figures if everyone's income contract by 10%, even with the Social Amelioration Fund or ACAP and the Social Business Wage Subsidy or SBWS in place. It is also noted that without the ACAP and SBWS, the number of poor will increase by 5.5 million. In terms of employment, the 2021 International Labour Organization's World Employment and Social Outlook estimate that the global crisis-induced jobs gaps will reach 75 million in 2021 before falling to 23 million in 2022. The ILO also projected that the global unemployment is expected to stand at 205 million people in 2022, greatly surpassing the level of 187 pre-pandemic in 2019. This corresponds to the unemployment rate of 5.7%. In the Philippines, the data released by the Philippine Statistics Authority a few days ago showed that the unemployment rate in July 2021 is estimated at 6.9%, the lowest since the pandemic began. While this is good news, the labor force participation rate in the same period has gone down to 59.8%, which is equivalent to 44.4 million Filipinos. This is lower than 1.9% in July last year. Pandemic has also exposed the gaps in our health and protection systems. Our healthcare system is under more strain with the daily increase in COVID-19 infections due to the more contagious Delta variant. Many hospitals have reached full capacity and have run out of intensive care unit beds for COVID-19 patients. Healthcare workers who are forced to work for longer hours have already been experiencing high levels of exhaustion. The pandemic has also resulted in new environmental issues such as the surge in the volume of waste from the widespread use of personal protective equipment from hospitals and households. These are some of the issues that motivated us to initiate a theme that would advocate rebuilding from the pandemic through a reset of our paradigms and practices, particularly those that may seem problematic and have to be changed. This morning, we open our four-part APPC webinar series with the topic, Resetting Capitalism. The session will discuss the key concepts of the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, which we took as an inspiration in developing the theme. These concepts include changing social and behavioral practices, altering views of what is essential and has economic and social value, and restructuring the institutions to enable them to harness the benefits from new practices and emerging worldviews. We will tackle how these concepts could be applied to developing economies such as the Philippines. The second webinar, which is on Thursday, September 16, will talk about ethical business. The third webinar scheduled on September 21 will feature the topic of green and inclusive recovery. And the fourth and last webinar on September 23 will focus on the topic of robust and healthy workforce. As in previous conferences, we will be joined by a pool of renowned international and local experts and policy analysts from various fields. These experts will include representatives from government, academia, private sector, and the civil society. They will share their insights on the issues, opportunities, and policy options related to these topics. At this point, I would like to thank our speakers for accepting our invitation to share their valuable insights in today's virtual event. To our guests and participants, thank you for being with us this morning. To the APPC Technical Committee composed of PIDS Research Fellows Dr. Adoracion Navarro, Dr. Margarita Di Buque Gonzalez, Dr. Chris Francisco Abrigo, who developed this year's DPRM theme and concept paper, guided by Vice President Marifi Ballesteros, thank you for your efforts. And to the DPRM team led by Dr. Sheila Siar, thank you for all the preparations for this year's DPRM celebrations. On behalf of the PIDS, I would also like to extend our special gratitude to the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas for always extending its generous support to PIDS and the conduct of the APPC. Let me take this opportunity to acknowledge the continued support and cooperation of the permanent members of the PRN Steering Committee composed of the National Economic and Development Authority, Civil Service Commission, the Philippine Information Agency, BSP, Department of Interior and Local Government, Presidential Management Staff, Department of Budget and Management, Senate Economic Planning Office, Congressional Policy and Budget Research Department. We also would like to thank Climate Change Commission, Department of Labor, and Securities and Exchange Commission for accepting our invitation to be part of this year's DPRM Steering Committee. Before I end, let me stress 2 points. First, we need to look ahead of the pandemic with optimism. Let's use this opportunity to resolve the cracks in our systems and to think and change our practices and mindset. Second, this challenging period requires us to get involved and be part of a solution. In closing, let us watch this video which sums up the message of this year's DPRM and APPC team. Thank you and good day.
All over the world are still grappling to address its impacts. In the Philippines, the pandemic has had an overwhelming effect on poverty and inequality, with certain groups more affected than others. Until now, people are forced to stay at home. Businesses which are already struggling to recover still have no choice but to halt their operations from time to time. And students are still finding ways to adjust to the new modes of learning, with physical classes still being prohibited. The crisis has strained health systems, exposing long-standing gaps in public health, and revealed major gaps in the current social protection systems. The pandemic has worsened existing environmental problems that the country faces due to the surge in the volume of wastes. Making matters worse are the new and more transmissible variants of the virus, causing more hospitalizations and deaths. Even countries that were initially successful in instituting protocols are once again scrambling to adjust their strategies. Most people ask, is there an end in sight? How can we move forward and recover from this crisis? It is about time that we reset our systems and start anew. Resetting means clearing errors and removing problematic parts, then rebuilding them by making the necessary improvements or by creating new ones so that we could come out of this pandemic better and stronger.
Inspired by the World Economic Forum's call for the Great Reset, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, is initiating a much-needed discussion on resetting our paradigms to rebuild our country toward an equitable, sustainable, resilient, post-pandemic future for all Filipinos. Through the annual Public Policy Conference, or APPC, which is the main and culminating activity of the Development Policy Research Month, or DPRM, we wish to open the conversation on how we can pursue this reset and rebuild agenda in our respective sectors.
To rebuild the country from the COVID-19 pandemic, We need to reset our paradigms and practices by balancing the interests of people, profit, and planet. Everyone has a role to play. A caring and compassionate business sector is crucial. This means placing equal importance on economic, social, and environmental well-being and sustainability. The academe should ensure that the new modes of delivering education and training under the new normal are accessible to all and will not widen economic and social inequalities. Schools should also improve their curriculum by imparting knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes that promote social responsibility and environmental stewardship. Civil society must be relentless in pushing for a more accountable and responsive governance and sustainable business practices, and bridge the gap between sectors that do not have access to government channels. Climate change has already severely affected the livelihood of most Filipinos, and the COVID-19 pandemic just worsened the situation. There is a need to strengthen measures to protect the environment and adopt climate resilience programs that will pave the way for a greener and bluer economy. The government must focus on setting the right policies to address the needs of the times. It must also improve the country's emergency preparedness, response, recovery, and rehabilitation. Lastly, the general public should reset its paradigms by adopting new practices at work, in learning, and in leisure that will help build resilience to adversities. Everyone must start living more responsibly by adopting more sustainable lifestyles.
Individually, we should build our resilience so that collectively we can be stronger as a nation, ready to fight the next crisis. Overcoming the current pandemic requires a whole-of-society approach driven by solidarity and compassion and guided by data and evidence.
Together, let us work toward a more caring business, a more nurtured environment, a more resilient, more inclusive, and more sustainable economy. Let us reset and rebuild for a better Philippines.
I am honored to introduce to all of you our keynote speaker. He joined the National Economic and Development Authority as Secretary of Socioeconomic Planning in April 2020, wherein his top 3 priorities include fast-tracking the national IDS system, the Economic Recovery Plan, and the Build Infrastructure Program. Prior to his current position, he was Undersecretary for the Strategy, Economics, and Results Group of the Department of Finance, and in this capacity, he helped the government implement its 10-point socioeconomic agenda by ensuring the equitable and sustainable financing through the Comprehensive Tax Reform Program. Before joining the government, he was the World Bank Senior Country Economist for the Philippines, and in this capacity, he advised the government on strategies and policies to attain more inclusive growth. Before joining the bank, he served as Assistant Professorial Lecturer of Mathematics and Economics at the Ateneo de Manila University, where he also completed his Bachelor of Science degree in Management Engineering. He completed his master's degree and PhD in economics at the University of the Philippines School of Economics. He was named one of the 10 outstanding young men and women in 2019 by the Junior Chamber International Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, Socioeconomic Planning Secretary and PIDS Board Chairperson, Dr. Karl Kendrick Chua.
Thank you, Sheila. Dr. Aniceto Orbeta, partners from the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, distinguished guests and speakers, colleagues in government, friends from the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. At the start of the Duterte administration in 2016, we envisioned that by 2022, we would have reduced our poverty rate from 21.6% of the population to 14%, or lifting 6 million Filipinos out of poverty and graduating to becoming an upper middle income country by 2022. By 2040, under our long-term vision, we envision a country that is free from extreme poverty and the Philippines graduating into a high-income country status. Our reforms in the past 5 years have enabled us to achieve our 2022 goal of lifting 6 million Filipinos out of poverty in 2018, or 4 years ahead of schedule. We entered the year 2020 with prospects of becoming an upper middle income country by the end of that year. However, the Philippines' transition to upper middle income country status was delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic. The good news is that our economic potential remains because of our early reforms, and we are on track to achieving this goal by the end of 2022 or early 2023. Focusing on the theme Reset and Rebuild for a Better Philippines in the post-pandemic world, this year's Development Policy Research Month challenges us to plan for a more resilient economy. To achieve this, we need to focus on our agriculture sector, which is the foundation of any country's structural transformation. A strong, productive agriculture sector provides the foundation for a competitive manufacturing sector and eventually a high-skilled services sector. However, in the Philippines, policy distortions have slowed the growth of agriculture and manufacturing in the last 6 decades. Instead of agriculture productivity paving the way to a labor-intensive manufacturing sector, then a capital-intensive manufacturing sector, and finally a high-skilled services sector, a different path happened. Agricultural productivity remains largely depressed and manufacturing has not grown to potential. As a result, a low-skilled services sector has emerged as the dominant sector in the economy. Employment shifted out from agriculture to informal services sector instead of manufacturing. To this end, the Duterte administration has enacted several reforms and invested trillions in social services and infrastructure to enable our proper structural transformation and strengthen our human capital development. Let me highlight 2 of these reforms today, the Rice Tarification Law and the Philippine Identification System, or the National ID Program. The impact of the Rice Tarification Law, or RTL, is twofold. First, it lowers rice prices for all Filipino consumers, especially the poor, including rice farmers. And second, it enhances the productivity of rice farmers through the Rice Competitiveness Enhancement Fund, or RCEF. The previous regime of quantitative restrictions on imported rice provided price support to our rice farmers. However, this resulted in domestic rice prices that were double than what the Thai and Vietnamese were paying. Elevated rice prices drove inflation and eroded the real income of the people, especially the poor who spent some 20% of their budget on rice. For the overall economy, it erodes our competitiveness. Before the enactment of the Rice Tarification Law, rice was consistently among the top 10 contributors to inflation from 2017 to March of 2019. After the Rice Tarification Law, rice ceased to be one of the top contributors to inflation and has been negative for most of the past 28 consecutive months since May of 2019. This allows the people, especially the poor, to more adequately meet their daily food and dietary needs, especially amid the pandemic. It will also help increase the regional competitiveness of Philippine wages, as lower rice and overall food prices increase people's real income. The Rice Tarification Law also provides support to rice farmers through the Rice Competitiveness Enhancement Fund, or RCEF, amounting to at least 10 billion pesos annually. With RCEF, rice productivity increased from 3.6 metric tons per hectare to around 4 metric tons per hectare. It translates to an additional income of 7,000 pesos per hectare. At the same time, rice production increased to 3.5 million metric tons in the third quarter of 2020, representing a 15% growth compared to the same period in 2019, a feat that the opposition to the reform had contested before of the impact of the Rice Tarification Law. With the government's continuous support through the RCEP and other programs, the rice sector produced 19.3 million metric tons in 2020, the highest in years despite the rice tariffication law, and in spite of COVID-19 and the consecutive typhoons in the fourth quarter of 2020. Moving forward, more are needed to improve the competitiveness of agriculture as well as other sectors through more cluster and value chain analysis. Let me now talk about the National ID Program. To enhance the government's ability to deliver social services, we are currently accelerating the National ID Program. The pandemic underscored the need for unhampered access to banking and social services. During the first enhanced community quarantine or ECQ imposition in April of 2020, the government provided 200 billion pesos in subsidies to 18 million low-income families, or around 75% of the population. However, institutional weaknesses pose a significant challenge in delivering assistance, causing some delays in the emergency response. That is why the President has given the directive to accelerate the implementation of the National ID or the PhilSys to provide all Filipinos a unique and digitalized ID. With PhilSys, there will be a single national database of all Filipinos. This will enable the government to identify beneficiaries for social protection programs efficiently. Apart from this, PhilSys will also facilitate financial inclusion by providing every Filipino with a valid proof of identity that is needed to open a bank account. This will allow low-income earners to open bank accounts, to receive cash transfers, and access other financial services directly. As of September 10, over 42 million Filipinos have taken the first step to be registered. This is the collection of demographic data. And almost 30 million have taken the second step to provide their biometrics in the registration center, despite the quarantine and the COVID-19 restrictions. And we aim to register at least 50 million Filipinos by the end of this year. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is challenging, but the Philippines has solid foundation to recover at the proper time. Reforms such as the rice tariffication law and the national ID are helping us restore our development trajectory and enabling the people, especially the poor, to access affordable food and better social services. From solid economic growth of around 6% in the 4 years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Philippines saw a contraction in 2020 in response to the pandemic, but we have begun to recover in the second quarter of 2021 with an 11.8% economic growth rate as we better manage the risks and balance the need of the people from both COVID and non-COVID concerns. Prospects remain encouraging as we project to grow by 4 to 5% this year and recover to pre-pandemic growth rates by the end of 2022 or early 2023. This recovery will be supported by our accelerated vaccination program, the safe reopening of the economy where we target lockdowns at the sources of highest risk only, and the full implementation of our recovery package. Within NEDA, we are also beginning to prepare for the country's needs beyond this pandemic and this administration. As Secretary, my priority for the remainder of my term is to give the next administration a better foundation on having more responsive infrastructure, innovation, which is the basis for sustaining our upper middle income country status, regional equity in allocation of budget for infrastructure and social services, and most importantly, the threats of climate change. PIDS and all of you development partners have important roles to play on these key areas. These are very tall orders, so we need to work together, especially during this time of great crisis. With the country's strong economic foundations and prior reforms, the government is committed to continue delivering timely policies to rebuild a better Philippines. Thank you very much and stay safe.
And thank you very much, Secretary Chua. To conclude our opening program, may I request all speakers and panelists to open your video for a photo opportunity. Gentlemen, please.
Okay, let's just wait for Mr. Periquet. Okay, Mr. Periquet, can you turn on your video, please? All right.
I also saw Gwen. I also saw Vice President Ballesteros. Dr. Ballesteros, could you also please turn on your video? Okay.
Okay.
We can
Yes.
proceed now.
All right. Please put on your best smile. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. All right. Back to you, Ma'am Sheila. Oh, here's Dr. Ballesteros. Okay, one more time. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Ma'am Sheila.
Thank you very much, Gwen. So we now go to our first APPC webinar, which will be on resetting capitalism. And this webinar session will be moderated by Mr. Romeo L. Bernardo. Mr. Bernardo has had a varied career in public institutions in the private sector. His public sector work spans teaching financial management at the University of the Philippines, a career at the Department of Finance, rising to Undersecretary, and working in multilateral institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. Presently, he provides business advice as board director in leading Philippine companies, and he has also done policy advisory for multilateral and bilateral institutions in the Philippine government in public finance, capital markets, public-private partnership, pension reform, and economic governance, and has also published studies and articles on these topics. He is the lead Philippine partner and advisor of Global Source Partners. And Mr. Bernardo has a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Economics from the University of the Philippines and a Master's degree in Development Economics from Williams College in the United States. Mr. Bernardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Sheila. Secretary Chua, President Orbeta, Professor Zingales, Mr. Periquet, Professor Tihanki, friends in the research community. I was going to write a review on the subject, but was spared the effort by my former Global Source Partners co-author, Maggie De Buque Gonzalez. Her thoughtful and comprehensive report titled Rethinking Shareholder Capitalism was shared with me, and I encourage all to read. You can also see her when she moderates the next forum on the subject. Let me summarize the key points in her paper and peppered with my own musings. Number one, there has been recent serious rethinking in both academia and business circles of the Friedman principle that the only responsibility of business is to increase profit, unquote. Initially occasioned by the global financial crisis, and now with the harsh impact of COVID, which revealed some of the weaknesses of the existing capitalist system. In the business sector, the debate focused on which market model would deliver the long-lasting and widespread prosperity, shareholder capitalism or stakeholder capitalism. Landmark events have skewed the discussion towards the latter, stakeholder capitalism. The August 2019 U.S. Business Roundtable, signed by over 180 CEOs of major corporations, released a statement on the purpose of a corporation that declared, quote, a fundamental commitment to all stakeholders, unquote, and listed specific commitments to customers, employees, suppliers, and relevant communities, in addition to the long-term value for corporate shareholders. Here in the Philippines, 20 business organizations signed last November 2020 a covenant for shared prosperity, where the country's business leaders vowed to raise the welfare of all local stakeholders. These same organizations and conglomerates have also walked the talk in addressing the pain points brought about by the pandemic, way beyond their commercial interests. These initiatives welcomed by and working hand in hand with government include construction of testing facilities, a lot of new laboratories, quarantine facilities, hospital facilities, vaccination procurement administration, and communication, just to cite some samples. These were all done in the spirit of bayanihan, of volunteerism, not because of diktat, but a recognition that corporations do have social responsibilities emanating from their dominant role and command over resources, apart from the individual shareholders' initiatives to help in this crisis. The pandemic and a talk of a new normal and a reset have raised the profile of the issue. Practical question of how do we translate high-level principles to actionable items for boards and management, especially for the major publicly listed companies. It gives rise to a couple of questions. How relevant are the limiting conditions to freedman in a developing country, Philippine context? Professors Hart and Zingales wrote, and I quote, "Freedman is right only if the profit-making and damage-generating activities of companies are separable, or if government perfectly internalizes externalities through laws and regulations, or in the case of government, does not if the shareholder population perfectly internalize the externalities and spend the appropriate amount for mitigation and correction." The second part of that is my annotation rather than a direct quotation. The assumptions of Professor Zingales include perfect market, no market failure, assumption, among which are that there is no market power, implying no rule-making power for the large companies, no externalities, the absence of markets, and whether they may or may not be internalized by shareholder. The answer is clearly affirmative that these limiting conditions do exist in developing countries like the Philippines. These assumptions are heroic and generally hold true only for small firms, the Friedman assumptions. And thus, Zingales concludes that maximization of shareholder welfare should now be the Pareto efficient for large firms, while the Friedman rule of maximizing shareholder value holds only for small firms. Which brings us to the next question. How do we operationalize stakeholder welfare optimization? Clearly, the relevant situation in a country like the Philippines with high concentration of large companies. Some of the issues that arise clearly are the question of defining what exactly stakeholder interests. Multiple masters and objectives can mean no guidance at all to the board. The issue of primacy of fiduciary responsibility to shareholders is still a live one, at least based on my reading of Philippine law. To give weight to interests of other stakeholders, often amorphously, on the premise of social responsibility is, and I quote, a de facto taxation without representation on the residual owners, the shareholders. Moreover, the conflicts of interest run not just across various stakeholder interests, but also how much weight to attach to conflicting social goods. To cite a very live debate here in the Philippines, there is the issue of that energy trilemma. What to overweight between energy security, energy affordability, equity, versus environment for a country which needs fossil fuel-driven baseload plants to address poverty, even as it only contributes 0.3% to global carbon, a rounding error. Then there are market-based solutions that have been defined in some of the writings of Professor Zingales, as well as in Maggie Gonzalez's excellent summary. There are such things as ESG ratings, which is now an emerging industry with dozens of players, but with different methodologies and emphases. But in all cases, seeming to overweight E, carbon reduction, versus S, social impact, and thus can raise questions to whether how relevant they are in the context of a developing country where poverty is the biggest pollution. Then there are also other mechanisms, quite interesting, and perhaps Professor Zingales can dwell on it. Explicit votes in the board of directors or even shareholders on policy so that the choices can be made explicit on these various objectives that we would like companies to address beyond maximizing shareholder value. Finally, I would be remiss if I do not call out more general questions posed by our organizers, a great reset. And these questions are, one, how must we reset our way of life and rebuild towards a better normal? Two, how can we build new foundations for the world's economic and social systems? Three, how can we steer the market towards fairer outcomes? Four, how can we ensure that investments advance shared goals, such as equality and sustainability? To help answer these questions, we are most fortunate and honored to have as our featured speaker, highly acclaimed thinker on the subject, Professor Luigi Zingales. Professor Luigi Zingales is the Robert C. McCormack Distinguished Service Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance and Faculty Director of the Stigler Center at Chicago Booth. Zingales' research interests span from corporate governance to financial development, from political economy to the economic effects of culture. He co-developed the Financial Trust Index, designed to monitor the level of trust that Americans have towards their financial system. In addition to his position in Chicago Booth, Zingales is currently a faculty research fellow for the National Bureau of Economic Research, a research fellow for the Center of Economic Policy Research, and a fellow of the European Governance Institute. Zingales also serves on the board of ProMarket and is a co-host of the podcast Capitalism. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Professor Zingales with a warm virtual applause. Thank you. Mr. Professor, all yours.
Patient to share. Sorry, am I speaking? Let me make sure that. Yeah. So can you hear me?
Yes, we do, Professor. Thank you.
Okay, good. So thank you for this invitation to speak in such a very interesting conference. So the topic I want to discuss today with you is to what extent we can and how we should reset capitalism. And today, capitalism is by and large corporate capitalism. And if you want to think about how to reset it, we need to rethink about the way corporations are run. And when you think about how corporations are run, you naturally think about the famous Friedman Doctrine. By the way, today is the day that 51 years ago, the New York Times published a famous piece, The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits. And whether you love it or hate it, Milton Friedman piece in the New York Times now 51 years ago shaped the conversation and to some extent shaped capitalism for the last 50 years. So what I want to discuss with you today is to what extent these ideas are still valid today, to what extent they're not, and how should we modify them if we want to reset capitalism. And by the way, if you want to learn more, the ProMarket produced a interesting book with a lot of essays written last year in honor of the 50 years anniversary, so you can get more educated by reading that. It's freely available on the website of ProMarket. So I think that the best way to think about Friedman is actually to think about Friedman as a theorem. It's a theorem that allows us to separate the complicated political decision from the business decision. And if you assume that companies are price and rule takers, which is tantamount to say that we're in a competitive market, that there are no externalities, or the government perfectly address them, that agents care only about their monetary payoff, and that contracts are complete, then maximizing long-term shareholders' value is leading to what we in economics call a Pareto optimal equilibrium. So what we economists tend to identify as an efficient equilibrium. Now, if you're an economist, you say, wait a minute, what is new? Because the way I frame this is very much in the spirit of the so-called first welfare theorem that were proved by Arrow and later Debray in the early 1950s. So just to give you a context, was only 20 years before Friedman wrote his piece. Now, to some extent, Friedman is doing nothing more than reframing that for a general audience. However, rather than using sophisticated mathematical arguments, he uses a much simpler argument that resonates very much with the public at large. And this argument is the following. In a free economy, stakeholders, not just shareholders, but stakeholders, voluntarily get together and they assign the residual right to the shareholders. So there are a lot of startups that are born every day in the Silicon Valley these days, and basically none of them allocate the right to vote to the customers or the right to vote to the employees. They always allocate the values to the shareholders. And so because they have the residual rights, they are the ones that suffer more of the cost of any decision. So as Bernardo is saying, imposing any additional burden on them is tantamount to taxation without representation. So now, if we want to think past Friedman, we need to understand why his theorem, that as all theorems, is right as long as the assumptions are right. So if you want to go past this, the conclusion of the theorem, we need to go past the assumption. In particular, we need to identify what assumptions are not verified in practice. And I think it's pretty easy to say that in the real world, contracts are not complete. There are a lot of contractual holes. However, this is not probably the most important cause of failure of the Friedman theorem, because even if you can see reasons to protect other investments, so for example, market may be competitive ex ante, but not competitive ex post when you sink specific investments. And as a result, not only shareholders, but also employees might be residual claimant. And if that's the case, it might be optimal to protect the employees from expropriation. So you would like to give them some vote. However, if this risk is so large, why don't we see in practice different form of contractual arrangement? Why in the world the overwhelming majority of corporations assign votes only to the shareholders, and in the countries where we observe co-determination, we never see co-determination as a result of contractual choices, we see as imposed by the law. And in the United States, there was a relatively recent decision that actually is of litigation between eBay and Craigslist that say that having chosen a for-profit corporate form, the Craigslist directors are bound by the fiduciary duties and standards that accompany that form. Those standards include acting to promote the value of the corporation for the benefits of its stockholders. The Inc. after the company name has to mean at least that. That's what some judges decide in the United States. Now, is the evolutionary argument necessarily right? No. There are things that can go wrong. There is bounded rationality. There are initial wealth constraint. There are limits in the law. However, in the United States, and increasingly so throughout the world, now there is such an entity called benefit corporation, where you can explicitly ask to be fiduciary to a broader set of stakeholders. Now, ironically, that corporation, that form of corporation, is chosen so far by very few companies. And the one who chose it, they do more for publicity reason, like Patagonia than for any particular governance reason. So I think that while this assumption clearly is not verified in practice, I don't think that this is the strongest point of attack against the Friedman theorem. Now, the second point is the second assumption that Friedman makes is that individuals care only about monetary return. Now, this is clearly false. Many of us are professors at university. We could make more money doing something else. We don't because we like what we do. So people maximize utility, don't maximize only income. And the example of donation is another one. And certainly investors that represent large foundations have goals other than mere profit maximization. Think about the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation is really as social goals. Now, what is interesting, whether you know it or not, the Gates Foundation is run under a Friedman separation principle, because what they do is they maximize the return from their endowment, and then they use the return so maximized to distribute to charitable contribution. And that's exactly what Friedman will say in this situation. Friedman is not necessarily saying that people don't have other objective other than money. In fact, you recognize that explicitly in this passage. However, he says that it is better for shareholders to maximize the profits and then donate their dividend to the desired cause, exactly like the Gates Foundation does. Now, the question is this true in general? And this is where the piece of that I wrote with Oliver Hart a few years back that Bernardo was so kind to cite is really useful here, because what we show is that every time there is a synergy between the social activity and the profit-making activity, then the Friedman separation theorem doesn't hold. So let me be more explicit. If it is cheaper not to pollute than to pollute and clean up, as I think is true most of the time, then it is more efficient for companies to adopt social objective such as protecting the environment than to simply maximize profits, distribute the profit to the shareholders, and let the shareholders do what they want socially with their money. So in some sense, what we are saying is whenever the objective of the Gates Foundation are intermingled in an inseparable way with the objective of the corporation they invest in, the Gates Foundation should not apply the Friedman principle of inducing companies to maximize simply profits and ignoring the social objective of the foundation. What they should do is they should maximize shareholder welfare. Well, welfare, it means the utility of the shareholders, not just their financial return. Now, of course, this opens complicated social charge issues that are still unresolved to that moment. Now we're getting into more important assumptions. So one of the assumptions, as Bernardo said, is that there are no large externality. But in fact, we know there are large externality, and pollution is certainly one. Now, interestingly, in a world in which shareholders were very locally based, it was easier for them to internalize this externality. Today, when, and thank in part to the finance profession that told people to diversify their portfolio, now companies are owned throughout the world. So Caterpillar was based in southern Illinois and used to be owned mainly by people in the area. Today, Caterpillar is owned by Japanese investment funds as much as by wealth fund in Norway or in Singapore. And so it's much more difficult for shareholders of this type to internalize the externality that they generate in the community. For example, what happens to Peoria when they move around. And in fact, Caterpillar recently moved the headquarters from Peoria, which is a small town in the middle of Illinois, to Chicago, creating extra devastation to the town of Peoria that was not doing very well to begin with. So in this world, you can argue that government regulation and not corporation should address these externalities. Now, what is funny is that generally this argument is made by the very conservative people who don't like regulation to begin with. So you have to choose and decide that if you really don't want corporation to get involved, you need to get the government involved, or the alternative is to let companies do something. The other point, which is very important, I will return to that momentarily, is that it would be much easier for the government to regulate if the companies did not lobby against this regulation. And I will come back in a second. Now, can this externality be resolved by the private sector? In a recent paper with Blockader and Hart, we show that if the majority of investors are even slightly altruistic, and if they are well diversified, then allow them to vote will force companies to internalize these externalities. So if I own a well diversified portfolio, the impact that any form of social activity will have on my profits is minimal, but I internalize the benefits if the company switch to reduce the externality. And so to the extent I have a little bit of interest in society at large, I am going to vote like the social planner would. So in the most extreme scenario, and we realize this is extreme, however, is indicative of a tendency which is important. If shareholders are well diversified, and if they're not completely egoistic, they're going to go in the right direction. And so much so that actually companies are started to fight back. And there is concern of this because this method could be very effective in resetting a certain corporate policy. Last but not least, the assumption requires that people are price takers, companies are price takers. Now, even Friedman agrees that monopolies should not maximize profits. And so Friedman simply believed that monopolies did not exist without government protection. But I claim that Friedman did not live in the world of large digital platforms where network externalities are so large that you tend to have a monopolistic position. And so how do you deal with an entity like Google? Should Google maximize profits without any regard of the impact that Google would have in society? So let me make a very concrete example. The way Google rank news impacts the way people vote in elections. And so Google can very easily, and I'm not saying has ever done that, but I say can very easily impact, for example, the outcome of the election in the Philippines just by ranking some people or the positive news about some people higher than the negative news about some people. Now, is the social responsibility of Google in Friedman language to maximize the profits and so maybe to elect somebody who will not tax Google or will treat Google well rather than let the Filipino people choose for their own benefit? And that is the big question. And how do we deal with international large monopolies like Google or Facebook are about? And historically, there have been only two ways to do that. One is nationalization, and the other is regulation. And I have to say that none of the two has worked particularly well, especially when it comes to large technology firms like Google or Facebook. And so one idea that I am thinking over with Oliver Hart is to say, maybe we should introduce a different fiduciary duty only for very, very large company. And this is very much linked to the last point, which is rule takers. In his famous 1970 piece, Friedman said that corporations should make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rule of the society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. Now, what is ironic here is that Friedman say you should maximize profits accepting the rules of society. However, basically at the same time, his colleague and dear friend Joe Stigler was writing a famous piece recognizing that corporations are able to capture regulators and legislature, shaping the regulation to their own advantage. And so one of the paradox is, if I really need to maximize profits, should I maximize profits to the extent of I manipulate the legislator to make me more profitable? And I think that this is quite extreme. Certainly, I say no, there is no social responsibility of a CEO to lobby Congress to be free of any responsibility for polluting. I don't think that even Friedman would have said that. And this is where the Friedman rules becomes untenable. Now, the question is, what can constrain companies on this front? And this is where my work with Eleonora Burkhardt and Oliver Hart can come handy, because evidence suggests that shareholders are increasingly pressuring companies to disclose their lobbying efforts and to actually reduce it in some cases. And this is the average level of support that lobbying disclosure proposition received in shareholders' votes that took place in the last few years. And as you can see, is a very increasing number and is quickly approaching the 51% threshold. But more importantly, if you look at this picture represents how much stock three investment companies own in all the major corporations in America. The three companies are, of course, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. And you can see that there is a variation. So they own 30% in Lockheed Martin, but they own less than 5% in Las Vegas Sands because it's a sin company and they don't want to be seen investing in gambling. But by and large, they own roughly 20% in all the largest corporations. And so it's very easy if you convince these three guys to pressure the companies to disclose their lobbying and to reduce their lobbying to get the work done. So it's sufficient that we, as investor in BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, demand more accountability from these companies to actually change in a substantive way the outcome. So concluding, what are the implications in the modern world? I will divide the world into two. If you are a small corporation, you have no market power, you are probably completely subject to regulation, and is behind your ability to change the rules of the game. And in that sense, applying the Friedman principle with the modification of the Hart and Zingales piece, so maximize shareholders' welfare, not value, is what you should be doing. However, if you are a very large corporation, you're probably likely to enjoy some market power. You are too big to fail and too big to jail. And most likely, you can change easily the rules of the game. For these companies, the Friedman principle does not apply at all. These companies should be held to accountable, but not just to their direct stakeholder, customer, and employees. They should be held accountable to society at large. Now, the question is, how large is large? And here, I think that we have a good example in the financial industry regulation where we have systemically important, there's a typo there, systemically important financial institution. But here, the type of imposition will be different. Here, we need to impose a fiduciary duty to our society. And my idea at the moment is that maybe the board member might be personally responsible for a multiple of the director fees they receive if the company opportunistically exploit the externalities at the expense of society. So if we were to demonstrate that Google board members were using Google algorithm to favor one candidate versus another, then the board members will pay out of their own pocket for this violation. And I think that this is something that needs to be elaborated further, but I think is a very important direction to reset capitalism. And if you want to know more about this topic, you should listen to my podcast where even the last issue is about ESG and the smoke and mirrors around that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Sorry, let me take off my mask. Thank you, Professor. A lot to think about and digest. And we have, let me just get their resume. Thank you. To provide reactions to your talk, we are honored to have two deep thinkers on this subject with familiarity with the Philippines and other EMCs. The Professor Zingales has raised a lot of very interesting questions, some of them with global application, some of them maybe more localized. The first speaker to address this will be Mr. Anton Periquet. Mr. Anton Periquet is Chairman and Managing Director of Campden Hill Group, an investment holding company that owns interest in publicly listed companies and private equities. He was until recently Chairman of BPI Asset Management and Trust Company, the wealth management arm of the Bank of the Philippine Islands, and is currently a director in various publicly listed companies, including Ayala Corporation, BPI, DMCI Holdings, the Max Group, Philippine 7 Corporation, Universal Robina Corporation, and Semirara Mining and Power Corporation. He is an experienced investor in equities, analyst, and co-founded Deutsche Regis Partners. Please help me welcome Mr. Anton Periquet. Anton, all yours.
Thank you for that introduction. Romy, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. And I'd like to acknowledge Professor Zingales for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. What we've heard from the professor were the theoretical basis for why unrestrained capitalism will not work in the real world, a world where individuals are not completely rational in the economic sense of the word, and where institutions are imperfect. What I would like to do here today is to relate this to the Philippine setting and then enumerate some of the constraints to reform along the lines suggested by Professor Zingales' framework. Let's start first by talking about the persistence of negative externalities here in our economy. Over a generation ago, we saw the disappearance of our forests due to unrestrained and many times illegal logging activities. We did not learn from this experience generations down, and according to a recent study published in the Wall Street Journal, we are today the third biggest polluter of the oceans in the whole world. I think they're talking here about plastic waste. We allow our property developers to wantonly disregard urban zoning restrictions, such that where there were once quiet, pleasant neighborhoods, old trees, open spaces, and even historic structures, there are now shopping malls and high-rise condominiums and traffic jams. Finally, we sometimes award projects such as land reclamation permits to private developers without consultation with surrounding communities and sometimes without even the benefit of public bidding. Such unbridled laissez-faire, while bestowing huge benefits to a few private parties, has resulted in negative externalities whose costs are borne by society at large in terms of environmental degradation and reduced quality of life. So those are just examples of the externalities. Now let's talk about the existence of imperfect competition and abuse of market power here. There was a recent Bloomberg survey that looked at the first 100 mainland Chinese companies that relocated factories from China to Southeast Asia when Donald Trump announced tariffs on goods produced in China and exported abroad. The same survey showed that of these 100, half of the plants were relocated to Vietnam, 17% to Indonesia, 5% to Thailand and Malaysia, and the balance to other ASEAN members. None of them were relocated to the Philippines. This despite our cozy relationship with China over the last 5 years. And why is this so? Perhaps the answer is the same as the answer to that age-old question of why minimum wages here have to be set at higher levels than those in Thailand, whose per capita income is double that of ours, and the same as in Malaysia, whose per capita income is 3 times what it is here. The answer is that our cost of living is simply too high for an economy at our stage of development and what you can get in return in terms of public services and infrastructure. In fact, a recent survey also showed that the cost of living in Manila is the second highest in the ASEAN, next only to Singapore. Now, why is our cost structure so high? Any regional equity analyst who compares companies in different countries in the region will tell you that we have some of the highest industry concentration ratios in the region. This indicates that there is a lack of competition in many sectors in our economy, which allows local firms to be price setters instead of price takers. So whereas in a situation of perfect competition, the consumer is king, here it is the producer who is king. This one-sided, this phenomenon explains why the only things we seem to be able to export on a meaningful scale after decades of development are people and coconuts. We simply cannot make things cheaply in this country. This one-sided arrangement between producer and consumer also explains, at least partially, why we have the most unequal distribution of income in the whole of Asia. This is measured in the most recent World Bank study, which showed that we have the highest Gini coefficient in Asia. So in sum, there is no doubt that we have a capitalist system that is broken. The question now is, how do we fix it? There are two approaches implied in Professor Zingales' presentation. The first is we change the behavior of our corporations. And second, we strengthen the government agencies that are tasked to police them, such that they become rule takers instead of rule makers. Now, here are my thoughts on these. First, in terms of changing corporate behavior, this can be achieved to some extent for companies that are publicly listed in the stock markets, particularly those with foreign institutional shareholders who are more ESG oriented and can exert pressure not only on elected directors, but on a firm's cost of capital through its valuation. The phenomenon is already evident in our own stock market. For instance, note the huge disparity in valuations as measured by PE ratios between companies perceived to be ESG compliant in the power generation space versus those that are largely coal-based. The disparity in PEs is as high as 10 times. This is in effect a penalty on companies perceived to be non-compliant in that their low valuations practically shut them out of the equity capital markets for fundraising. The problem really lies with the majority of our firms that are not publicly listed, in most cases SMEs that are fully owned by single proprietors and not subject to pressure from the capital markets. These institutions may not exactly be powerful enough to be rule makers, but given our weak institutions, they can get away with being rule breakers. They are in effect accountable to no one. They are almost single-mindedly profit-oriented. Some do not pay minimum wages. Some do not pay taxes even. So there are externalities too, even in this SME space. A second problem with trying to change corporate behavior to make it more responsible to society or shareholder welfare as a whole is the problem of unequal burden sharing and the potential loss of competitiveness. Good behavior, as we know, is many times more expensive than bad behavior. For instance, becoming environmentally compliant. In an extremely price-conscious market, such as the Philippines, compliance can mean loss of market share. That is, unless everybody in the sector is forced to comply. This brings us to the second path, strengthening the rule-setting institutions so that they become impervious to external influence. In other words, good governance. Good governance is the problem our country has faced since even before you and I were born, which successive people power revolutions have failed to correct. Good governance indeed has been described and really is still for us the impossible dream. The church says that the long-term solution is voter education, or what they call conscientization, making people more aware of the long-term consequences of their choices at the voting booth. This solution, however, can take generations. In fact, evidence suggests that we are moving in the opposite direction, if the last World Bank report is to be believed. There are, however, smaller steps towards progress that can be taken. One is campaign finance reform. I do not believe we can completely stop capitalists from lobbying, particularly when they are the major shareholders of a company. That is their right. But with the help of a free and fearless press, we can limit the amounts they can lawfully contribute to a campaign. Secondly, another possible solution is economic legislation to promote greater competition by removing foreign ownership and trade restrictions. This is a cause that is favored by the Foundation for Economic Freedom, a foundation that was co-founded by our moderator, Romeo Bernardo, and is actually making good progress in terms of getting that bill filed and passed by congressmen. So I think I have raised a few questions and made a few observations. I heard the bell ring a few seconds ago, so I believe my time is up. But thank you for hearing me. Thank you.
Thank you, Anton. A lot to think about, and I hope you're staying on for the Q&A. You've um, uh, scored a lot of interesting points that I'm sure will elicit some response from our audience. But before we go to the Q&A, allow me to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Benito Tihanki, who is a professor of business ethics management and organization department of the Ramon V. Del Rosario College of Business of the De La Salle University. Dr. Benito Tihanki is also head of the Business for Human Development Network. His research focuses on corporate governance, leadership ethics, and institutional change. He conducts governance and management development seminars for various corporations. He serves on the boards of the Philippine Academy of Management, Shareholders Association of the Philippines, and the International Humanistic Management Association. Has been awarded as Best Business Columnist for his writing in Managing for Society in the Manila Times by the Catholic Mass Media Awards, and the Outstanding Educator in Corporate Governance by the Financial Executives of the Philippines, Finex. Take it away, Professor Ben. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Romy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
All right. Let me just try to share if it works. Are you able to see my title screen fully displayed?
We see it, Professor. Thank you.
I want to make sure it's a presentation view. Okay. Warm greetings to
Excuse me,
yes.
let me just cut up. Can you show it in a presenter mode, sir? Please.
All right. So I was
display.
concerned about that. Thank you for the feedback. Okay, let me try this again. What about now? Does it show fine?
Yes. All good. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Gwen. So, regards to Professor Zingales, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very meaningful conversation. I've titled my response, Resetting Philippine Capitalism for the Common Good, Corporate Governance for Shared Prosperity. And what I'd like to do is respond to specific points that Professor Zingales made, which I think are very relevant to our situation in the Philippines. So let me start with the first point. I agree that Philippine corporate boards should have fiduciary duty towards society because this is strongly aligned with our Constitution and the Code of Corporate Governance. And let me spend some time explaining this. In our Philippine Constitution, the vision of our society is made very clear in Section 9 under State Policies. It says that we aim to free people from poverty through policies that provide adequate social services, promote full employment and a rising standard of living, and an improved quality of life for all. So therefore, all policies and practices of business should be aligned with this goal. The social license of business emanates also from the Constitution under Section 6 of National Economy and Patrimony, which states that the use of property bears a social function and all economic agents shall contribute to the common good. So therefore, from the get-go, our Constitution states that property, while private property is allowed in our society, it always has a common good dimension. It is not simply for the private benefit of property owners, but must always take into account the interest of others who are affected by the use of property. That section continues that all businesses, all economic entities, including corporations, of course, may operate, but it is the right and the duty of the state to promote distributive justice and to intervene when the common good so demands. So this important provision in the Constitution sets the stage for why businesses are allowed to exist, are licensed to exist. Unfortunately, this mandate is often lost among
business owners and even business leaders because they construe private property as simply being a private right. In the recently revised Code of Corporate Governance of 2017, the constitutional mandate was supported by Principle 16, which says that the company should be socially responsible in all its dealings with the communities where it operates. It should ensure that its interactions serve the environment and stakeholders in a positive and progressive manner that is fully supportive of balanced development. So we can see here that even the Code of Corporate Governance, which principally but not exclusively applies to publicly listed corporation, emphasizes the social license of the firm. So I try to diagram this. This is our existing society where you have a lot of inequality. Our goal is through business activity to grow the middle class and eventually reach the vision of the Constitution as it is stated, a rising standard of living and an improved quality of life for all. Many of our neighboring countries have achieved this, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, to name only a few, but we are definitely a laggard in this regard. So businesses have a key role in ensuring that our constitutional vision is achieved because businesses, in effect, are welfare or dignity pumps. They enable opportunity for those who have less in life so that as a community, we can grow and achieve our vision as a country. The next point of Professor Zingales, which I think strongly applies in the Philippine case, is that, and in relation to point one, is that it is essential to protect other stakeholders from expropriation because corporate capitalism dominates in the Philippines, and as a side effect, because of weak institutions, it leads to market and wealth concentrations and widening inequalities. Pre-pandemic, of course, we all know how strong our economic growth was. The Philippine Stock Exchange was rising very impressively. And of course, our economic growth was averaging about 6.5. And now, of course, we've taken a hit in the stock market because of the pandemic. But large enterprises really drive the economy. For this graph, we can see that the GDP growth, a big portion of GDP growth is really accounted for by the revenue of the top 1,000 corporations. And I try to disaggregate this further, and we can see that the top 100 corporations account for 35% of GDP, the top 200 account for 44%, and most importantly, the top 50 conglomerates account for almost half of GDP. So we can see how extensively corporate domination exists in our country. So if we look at the business, of course, there are several groups of stakeholders that are affected by business operations. Oftentimes, a lot of emphasis only goes to a few. But in general, in the constitutional vision, the business and large business corporations in particular should be like Wi-Fi routers, spreading benefits and welfare to all members of society, and of course, properly to their investors as well. But there tends to be a bias for investor benefit, especially profit, which should be residual in principle, but often this is front-loaded to ensure a particular target, then everybody else has to share with what's left behind, which is really the opposite of the spirit of being a residual claimant. And of course, we are a consumption-driven economy, so our people want products better, faster, cheaper. Unbeknownst to them, this sometimes works against the common interest of people. And there are many ways that companies produce externalities, unsafe or unhealthy products, tax evasion, job insecurity and poor job quality for workers, delayed payments for suppliers, advertising that spread falsehoods or misperceptions and even indecency, of course, waste dumping. And investors also suffer when their funds are misused or are not accounted for transparently. So if we look at different business models, if we contrast it with the constitutional vision, we have businesses which I call our maintaining models, meaning the disparity in society as a whole is replicated within the company, where you have a few benefiting from most of the fruits of the business activity, while the majority are deprived of them. Ideally, we should have what we call ameliorating business models, those that use their constitutional mandate to really uplift the opportunities for everyone that is touched by the company. And what we should be most wary about are what I call exploiting models. These are businesses whose very financial model depends on really keeping labor as cheap as possible or environmental controls as cheap as possible. And a lot of times, all of this cost saving accrues to benefits for only a very few at the highest level of the company. In fact, former NEDA chief Shelito Habito explained it this way in 2012, when he said the 40 richest Filipinos saw their collective wealth rise 13 billion over the past year, a 37.8%. Our GDP went up 17 billion. Thus, he says, the increased wealth of our richest 40 individuals alone is equivalent to the bulk, 76%, or more than 3/4 of the country's overall increase in income last year. And part of what makes this possible, of course, is that our legal system allows for corporate pyramiding within the conglomerate structure, where family holding companies are able to establish layers of companies where their proportionate investment becomes progressively smaller, but since they retain dominant control, they're able to control and extract cash flows as they wish. And so given the pandemic, it's not a surprise, of course, that even though our economy is shrinking, the wealth of Filipino billionaires is in fact increasing. And so here, point 3 that Professor Zingales mentioned is that employees are important residual claimants and not just stockholders, because employees make firm-specific investments, meaning they gain expertise in a specific company. It's not as if that if they're unhappy with where they're working, they can immediately shift to another company because a lot of their knowledge and experience apply to a specific company. In fact, it might be argued that it's really shareholders who can easily shift because they can unload their investment at any time and move to another investment. The Constitution actually states that labor and capital are partners, that labor has the right to the just fruits of production, while capital has the right to reasonable returns on investment. In practice, of course, capital has been privileged as evidenced by persistent poor job quality. In other words, even though when the capital market was growing at record rates, job quality remained very low in general. And therefore, the result is persistent poverty despite strong growth. So this is typical news that we see. Despite robust growth, income inequality widens. And even in the map of the Philippine Statistics Authority, the government reports a 16.6 poverty rate. But of course, we can take this with a grain of salt because this is based on a 10,400 a month income for a family of 5. But we can see that the 16.6 mean really doesn't mean anything because in many parts of the Philippines, we have poverty as high as 36 to 60%. And by comparison, when we talk about poverty reduction compared to other countries, we have one of the slowest rate of poverty reduction. It's really dramatic, for example, when you compare it with Vietnam, where the reduction has been quite dramatic. Of course, Thailand and Malaysia have been outperforming us in this metric for some time. Even when we look at the growth of middle class, we can see that we are also one of the slowest, with other countries outpacing us in terms of middle class improvement. And the World Bank, in their analysis, says that a big part of what explains this is poor quality jobs. So the primary constraint facing poor households in urban areas is the low level of wages paid to unskilled workers, where we see that poverty among the employed is relatively the same as total poverty as a whole. And finally, Professor Zingales makes an important point that oftentimes businesses are not rule takers. In fact, they are rule influencers, and in some ways they can be seen as rule makers because weak institutions allow business regulatory capture, and this has to be made transparent and involve other stakeholders. In the 70s, there was a push for corporate reform led by the Philippine UP Law Center, and where they introduced this vision of the corporation because we had been under the 1905 corporation law. So this was the first major revision of the corporation code. And they said they seek to make a new concept of business corporations, not merely as entities established for private gain, but as partners of the government in spreading the benefits of capitalism for general social and economic welfare. So those who follow the benefit corporation movement in the West will right away note that actually we already wanted the general corporation to be a benefit corporation in the Philippines. In fact, in their concept paper, there were already progressive provisions there, an anti-monopoly provision, especially to control unfair competition and market concentration. There was a proposal to make employee representation in the board of directors possible by way of bylaws provision. This is, of course, similar to, but a very minimal version of co-determination as practiced in countries like Germany, for example. And then there was a provision for a benefit fund to be administered for the benefit of the communities. Now, interestingly, when the Interim Batasan Pambansa ruled on the Corporation Code in 1980, they retained this inspiring rationale as the reason for the code, but none of the progressive provisions ever saw the light of day. So clearly, a lot of business lobbying took effect that made it very different from the intention. And in the case of the Code of Corporate Governance, I had direct experience with this. In 2002, shortly after the Enron debacles and related scandals, of course, the SEC, like other countries, instituted corporate governance reform. So they did this by asking board directors to consider corporate stakeholders. But however, in 2009, the SEC reversed itself and removed the stakeholder principle. And I appealed this, and my appeal appears here. In August 11, I wrote to the commission as a professor, noting my dismay that they dropped the stakeholder concept. And then I requested the commission to reconsider that to ensure that the tendency of corporations to neglect other stakeholders will be minimized, because corporations, when left unchecked, become externalizing machines. 4 months later, the response of the SEC to me was that they had considered this, and in fact, the SEC had consulted with the Management Association of the Philippines, Finex, etc., and they considered this a lengthy consultation with the covered companies, and that they cannot go beyond what the law states. Now, what is immediately striking is that the stakeholders that were consulted were the corporations themselves. Certainly, it was not clear in this letter that they consulted labor organizations or environmental advocacy groups or even consumer rights protection groups. So as far as this letter is concerned, the only relevant stakeholders were the companies themselves. So therefore, I think that moving forward, we can support the Covenant for Shared Prosperity, which is really being promoted by the Management Association of the Philippines and several other institutions, so that we can remind businesses to go back to the fundamental mandate of the Constitution, which is to take care of employees, to provide helpful products and services, to treat their supply chain and their financiers fairly, to help the communities of which they're a part, to take care of the environment for present and future generations, and to give the rightful return to the equity investors. If we do that, we can turn our country into the country we all dream of, and therefore have the development that the Constitution calls on all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ben. Many interesting points. We're now reached the stage of the open forum. Maybe before I go to the chat box, let me say first that it's unfortunate that Anton Periquet has had to rush to attend to corporate duties. So he's no longer with us. However, let me try to perhaps capture some of what he said and raise the first question as well. I think there's a fair measure of agreement and among all the speakers, including myself, that we really should be moving towards a stakeholder welfare model, certainly for the larger corporations and certainly for a country like the Philippines that has does not manifest the Friedman theorem basic conditions. I guess the question really is, and I've telegraphed this in my introductory remarks, how does one really operationalize stakeholder welfare assessment? I sit in a board of many corporations, and number one, there are clearly competing interests among stakeholders. How do you actually balance them in actual decisions? Apart from the conflicts among interests of various stakeholders, you even have to go even a prior question: who is a stakeholder? But even among stakeholders or a common interest, the social good, everybody will have their own appreciation of what is the social good. I know Professor Ben has talked about the common good, but the one example I've cited, which is a very live one, is to what extent do we overweight in our decisions as a company trying to reduce the carbon to what is already now a rounding error versus, for example, the importance for a country like the Philippines to have baseload plant capacity for in order to address poverty issues. There are other similar issues. For example, there was a very lively debate on endo. I think some people who've studied it think that our own policies on security of tenure are overly liberal, more akin to EU standards than the US, but it has the consequence, therefore, of perhaps hurting job creation. How does one balance a desire to listen to the labor groups and have even more liberal security of tenure on the social objective, which I think Secretary Chua also underlined, of needing to create jobs for a country that has a 25% underemployment and a 10% unemployment? For example, would you care? And finally, Professor Zingales talked about a very innovative approach of actually polling the stakeholders. Could you talk more about how to do that? So maybe if I can, I've talked too much. Maybe I pass on the two questions to the two speakers. Thank you.
So first of all, let me thank both Benito and Anton, even if he has left, for their comments that are very thoughtful and very appropriate. I would like to answer to Romy's question, two questions. The first one is how do we go about implementing a stakeholder-friendly way? And this is where I think I would like to draw a distinction between what people generally say, running the interest of stakeholders, or a fiduciary duty to our society. Because when it comes to people who literally have a stake, a direct stake, so are at the bargaining table, I still think that in general, they can resolve these problems among themselves, negotiating among themselves. And I don't see necessarily a role of the government to create a duty to be on one side or the other, also because when it comes to distribution, this is very tricky. This is different when it comes to externalities, because when it comes to pollution, the rest of the country that suffer the pollution is not at the bargaining table. And so this is where I think there is a more legitimate, in my view, justification of introducing this fiduciary duty. That is, how Benito was saying, a social functional property. And by the way, it's interesting because the Italian constitution has a very similar article about the social functional property. I don't think that that exists in the United States, but it's interesting that the Philippines and Italy have this point in common. But so how do you go implementing that? That's relatively easy. So think about a case of pollution. Today, and let's think about, forget for a second CO2 emission, think about some poison that you dump in the river. Today, the way companies basically are required to reason is they look at what is the cost of avoiding pollution versus what is the cost of polluting, where the cost of polluting is not what the society bears as a cost of pollution, but simply what is their probability of being caught multiplied by the fine if they are caught. So by design, companies look at a very distorted picture. And what we are saying is that instead of doing this analysis, and this analysis is often done implicitly because they don't want to put in the board minutes that you make this calculation, but sometimes it's done explicitly. I wrote a case study of DuPont Corporation that polluted massively the Ohio River Valley by dumping a PFOA, a very toxic substance, in the water. And thanks to the disclosure at trial, you see that these guys have done an analysis and they say, oh, this is what it cost us to reduce pollution, but it's not worth it. And they don't say explicitly because we're not going to be caught, but kind of you can deduce it very easily. So what I'm saying is that situation, you should actually factor in what is the societal cost in terms of number of people will die, damage to the environment, etc. And do an analysis, because if it is socially inefficient to pollute, as a company or as a director of a company that is a large company, what I would like to introduce is a duty not to pollute. So I think that that's the distinction between a society, a duty to society versus a simple duty toward the stakeholders. When it comes to how to implement this corporate governance by voting, I think that this is relatively easy in the United States, but I take the point that I think Anton raised, which I think is a very good one, in companies where in countries where most companies are not publicly traded, they are heavily concentrated, or you have a conglomerate structure. I think that solution is not very valuable. So before trying to describe my solution, let me suggest a very simple idea. It's not my idea. I think Randall Mork at University of Alberta promoted this, but I think it's very clever. And he say, if you want to make conglomerate more difficult, it's very simple. You don't have any tax credit for corporate taxes paid at the corporate level, so that every layer of corporation, you end up paying a layer of taxation. And once you have 2 or 3 layers, by the time the money arrives to the last layer, there's nothing left. So that makes it extremely expensive to have corporation. So that's a measure to increase tax revenues and decrease conglomerates. So and very simple to implement. It's not like a complicated law and so on and so forth. I doubt this will ever be passed in the Philippines, but I think that it's a good idea. Now, how do you, in a country like the United States or the United Kingdom, where you have diffuse ownership, how can you get corporations to follow the interests of shareholders at large and not just the interests of managers or the interests of a few large owners? And the answer is very simple, especially in a world in which people invest in index funds, you want these index funds to characterize themselves for an investment policy. So I am the Vanguard Green Fund, and I'm green not because I buy green companies, I'm green because every time a proposition goes in front of the shareholders and this favors the green side, I will vote for the green side. Or I am the apolitical Vanguard Fund, in which every time there is an issue about lobbying, I vote against lobbying. And in this way, it's very easy for Vanguard to manage all these funds, because from a management point of view, you manage everybody in the same way with one feature. The day you go to the shareholders meeting, you allocate your votes based on how people sort themselves out. And in the same way in which you don't need to know every single proposition or every single law that your party representatives vote in parliament, but you vote for a party ideology because you think that that represents you. I think that this mutual fund of different color, if you want, or different flavor, they can represent your ideology in a very effective way. And the beauty of it is, in politics, we're not sure that this party will naturally arise, because the people starting a party, they do it mostly for ideological reasons, not for profit reasons. But in this particular world, if investors start to be sensitive to the way their mutual funds vote, there is money to be made by multiplying these funds and catering to investors' desires. So my focus that unless regulation will intervene to stop it, in the next 5 years, we're going to see a blossoming of this variety of in funds that cater to the desire of investors. Sorry, you're mute.
Sorry. Very much, Professor. Most comprehensive response. Before I turn over to Professor Tihanki, may I have a follow-up coming from both addressed to both of you, but just to make it neater. This is coming from Professor Raul Fabella from the UP School of Economics and our only living national scientist in economics. This is Raul, incidentally, wrote a thin but very heavy, substantively pamphlet on capitalism and inclusion under weak institutions. And he talked about a country like the Philippines with weak public institutions can actually have at the same time large conglomerates that play a very positive role. So in some ways, that is a feature of the economy. Now here's a follow-up question. He said, Mr. Periquet basically spoke of a political and corporate environment where big companies, especially listed companies, follow rules, and closely held smaller companies don't. Weak regulation and weak legal system. What mechanism is left in this case? So he's addressing it to Professor Zingales, but I'd like to address it also to Professor Tihanki. But if you don't mind, Professor Ben, Professor Zingales first, and then afterwards, if you can address both that question and my earlier question. Thank you.
Sure.
We'll try to be brief so that Benito has the time to answer both questions. But from my point of view, I think that it's very simple. The answer is you have to strengthen the regulatory institutions. I know nothing about the Philippines, so I'm out of my element. But my question for you is, if conglomerates, a large institution, follow the rules, why don't they have the political power to strengthen those rules for everybody else? It is in their interest to do so. So I don't understand why they don't want to do that.
That's a perfect opening to Professor Tihanki. Can you try to answer both the general questions and the particular question coming from Professor Zingales about why aren't we coming up with better rules? Not just better rules, I guess, better implemented rules as well. Because I think we have a lot of rules here, but which probably ties up to our whole electoral process. Professor Ben, kindly.
Yes, thank you. Well, I have 5 questions already in my list, so I'll try to respond to the holistic question of mechanisms. The situation we're dealing with is a highly complex social situation with historical path dependencies, etc. But if we think of mechanisms, if we are to change an institutional arrangement, research has showed that we should pay attention to at least 3 aspects. The regulatory, and a lot of people refer to the laws, but as we all know, we have probably one of the highest per capita number of laws in this country as compared to other countries. So we're right there. In fact, our constitution is highly progressive. Our code of corporate governance specifies social responsibility. We have excellent laws, in my opinion. Enforcement is an entirely different matter. So we have an extremely under-resourced justice system. Hardly any white-collar criminal ends up in jail, especially the more prominent they are. So there you are. But the other mechanism is, of course, the normative mechanism. This is where education, professional associations, and professionals in general, such as lawyers, for example, and accountants, have to exert some pressure, some normative pressure on what they think is proper behavior for corporations. Of course, now, because of the governance revolution around the world, we've added layers of corporate compliance officers, fraud examiners. We just create new and more formal roles. But in general, we still have a deficit of normative understanding of the duty of business to society. Now, there's a question in the chat whether we need to push companies towards social enterprises. I believe social enterprises have a role to play, but they are a drop in the bucket given what we're dealing with. Because our constitution is very clear. All businesses are socially bound to always think of the welfare of the whole. The other real problem that we need to deal with is the cultural cognitive mechanism. Let's face it, because of our feudal history, Filipinos are still feudal by mindset. They believe that those who have more property are somehow should be given more deference in society, or those who are politically powerful are somehow higher. But the Constitution is very clear. We are a Republican democracy. All power emanates from the sovereignty of the people and so on. But I believe as a society, we have completely failed to educate our citizenry on this fundamental concept. Therefore, the situation we're seeing in the corporate field is simply a reflection of our feudal mindset, where we do not hold companies accountable for the externalities that they have. Even my own MBA students who are highly educated, middle class, they will not even hold their mobile phone providers accountable for poor service. Whereas I always tell them, look, you're paying good money, you're a millennial, you have 2,000 in your Facebook account, exert some power so that we can have better service. Otherwise, we not only have expensive mobile service, but one of the slowest in the region and very little competition. So all of this combined. So if we think of mechanisms, therefore, we have to address regulatory mechanisms, normative mechanisms, and cultural cognitive mechanisms, because all of these have to come together so that we can ensure that our businesses are more socially responsive. Thank you, Rami.
Thank you, Professor. And let me now go to the questions in the chat box in the time available to us. This is from June Neri from the Bank of Philippine Islands, Chief Economist. This is to Professor Zingales. Are global hedge funds, property developers, and investment banks able to lobby the Federal Reserve and the ECB? Aren't some FOMC ECB members alumni of top investment banks? Does this have any externalities? Has this exacerbated inequality, parentheses, asset prices versus average wages? Professor?
Yeah, the answer is yes, it does. I think is a major source of concern, is one of the many forms of capture, and I think that has become worse in recent years.
Thank you, Professor. This one from Mary Racelis, uh, a noted community leader and sociologist. How will the reforms of the small group of top corporations affect the majority of the population in the informal sector? Maybe I should address this more to Professor Ben.
Yes, that's an excellent question. As I tried to show in my presentation, our total economy is very much controlled by large business. Of course, by sheer statistical number, we have a lot of informal and small businesses, but the sheer volume of big business is really a dominant force. And therefore, since business is an integrated activity, a lot of the supply chain, small suppliers are also connected to these big businesses. So if big businesses treat their supply chain well, for example, if I'm a big business and I have a supplier, I should pay the supplier on time, right? Because of course, suppliers also have employees who have families to feed, etc. But if a big business customer will delay payments to a supplier because they have the size to do it, meaning the supplier has no choice because they need the big account, obviously the small businesses are at the mercy of big businesses. So we cannot underestimate the impact of big business. Even small fishermen use the mobile phones provided by a telco. So from the moment you wake up to the moment you sleep, big business affects all of us. The problem though is the heavy concentration of business activity among very few conglomerates because of the lack of competition. So this is something that needs to be addressed. We need to have more millennials setting up businesses, being IPO'd, growing, so that we have more choices, so that we can have businesses that will really rise because of merit, not because of connections to political dynasties or the right family names, but really because they're able to provide helpful services for the community. So business is really an integrated activity, and big business has a tremendous impact. So if we can influence big business leaders to see society as a whole as their playground that they need to uplift as a whole, this will also grow their market. Because let's face it, if we don't have a growing middle class, the market, even for big business, is really very small. We have such a small market because of our lack of vision. But if we grow our middle class, there's more for everyone. But that's the problem. Now we need to change our mindset so that we can think of growing the whole Philippine economy and not just those of a few. Thank you, Romy.
Thank you, Professor. This is a related question, and I may address this to you as well, from Ms. Maria Lourdes Mendoza. How do we promote the, quote, ameliorating business model? Should we pursue the passage of legislative proposals which provide incentives for business people to convert their traditional businesses into social enterprises? Yeah, after hearing what you said about we have a lot of laws, what we have as poor enforcement, I wonder what more, how more legislation that with more granularity will affect behavior of firms. But please, Professor Tihanki.
We don't need more laws, Romy. We need, as I said, we need normative change and also cultural cognitive change. In front of the De La Salle University, we have 7 stoplights. And I always observe the number of cars that beat those stoplights. It's completely proportionate to the security people and police who are present. So therefore, for many drivers, a stoplight is a suggestion. So therefore, we don't need more stoplights. We need to educate drivers that they need to take driving seriously. That since they are given a license to drive, they are stewards of the safety of others. So as I said, this is a cultural cognitive shift. It will take a while. This is a generational thing. But hopefully the pandemic and the need to reset will give us that impetus to really get our act together as a society. But certainly good enforcement will be a good start. We need to make examples of business who do not take care of the environment, who deprive their employees of what they deserve, who sell unsafe products. We need to show examples of what happens when these basic duties to society are not met.
Thank you, Professor. And I guess webinars like this and the work that PIDS is doing is part of the effort to educate people
Definitely.
and to conscientize board directors as well on what their responsibilities are. This one is from another question from Professor Fabella to Professor Zingales. On welfare maximization versus value maximization of welfare means different things to different people and use different metrics. I guess what he means is value maximizations versus welfare maximization. How these metrics are amalgamated is a problem. Arrow theorem. Value is much easier to measure. Wrong choice of welfare metrics leads to poverty. He cites an example. CARP identified land ownership as a metric and created poverty in rural sector. He's referring to our 30-year experience in CARP, which has actually contributed to making agriculture one of our stagnate due to the variety of problems. Professor, would you care to?
Sure. No, there's no doubt that in every time there's a social choice issue, we are faced with the Arrow's impossibility theorem. So there's not a perfect solution. However, two things. Number one, if you understand this problem, maybe you want the government to intervene even more to make corporate governance easier. So the moment corporations have to take on some new jobs, like considering other externalities and so on and so forth, they are faced with bigger challenges to govern themselves. And so a more efficient government in regulatory externality is a government makes proper governance easier for corporations. So that's point number one. Point number two is that even if there is a R impossibility theorem, however, you can still move on the margin and make improvements by asking people to vote. And so if today, what we are doing de facto is we assume that everybody puts a zero weight on anything other than money. And so we're not getting rid of the R impossibility theorem. We are basically forcing only one dimension, ignoring the other, and claiming victory. So what our paper is pointing out that we need to be more aware that there are this other dimension, and maybe it's optimal to, in some cases, ignore consideration other than financial return. But there is no theorem, at least no theorem I know, that say that this is the right thing to do all the time.
May I respond, Romy?
Yes, please, Professor.
So I believe that related to what Professor Zingales mentioned earlier, in any deliberative body like a corporate board, there is really diversity in opinion, which is why the board has to vote, the CEO has to present an action plan, etc. So all of the complexities of the environment that the business faces are incorporated in that setting. It's not as if a single actor needs to optimize a linear programming function, etc., given certain constraints. This is not reality. It's really deliberation, discussion. In fact, we can show quite a lot of evidence that companies have been known to make suboptimal decisions, even if we apply the profit maximizing rule as the basis. Clearly, there could be conflict of interest issues or rent-seeking issues. But in general, I think the fact that you have several members in the board, they are supposed to approach this from a multi-criteria decision-making perspective, where they look at several, and this is how we do things. When I go shopping, I'm not just thinking of one. When I go to Lazada or Shopee, never did I think of only one criterion. I'm thinking of several criteria at the same time This is normal human existence. So we are always trying to look at how this will achieve multiple goals. And this is true for businesses as well. But it helps if the business leaders remember their social license, that they have a mandate to consider making sure that they don't penalize communities who don't have, or people who don't have a seat in the table. And I always wish that independent directors, for example, can take the common good perspective when they are in a board discussion, that they are there to remind the rest of the board about the social mandate, what the Code of Corporate Governance says. Because after everything is said and done, if a company makes consistently socially sensitive decisions, its reputational capital will increase, and therefore even its appeal to a lot of the new markets like the millennials and soon the Gen Alpha, because they're very sensitive to these things now. So it's also in the best interest of companies to be sensitive to how the rest of society thinks. Thank you, Romy.
Thank you, Professor. Indeed, I think the corporate governance code does put on the shoulders of independent directors greater responsibility to consider objectives of the corporation beyond the certainly the majority or controlling shareholder. And additionally, I guess there have been we already talked about the perils of looking to government to improve corporate governance, given government itself has its own problems in implementation. But additionally, there are watchdogs, regulators, and international watchdogs. I made reference to a plethora of ESG rating agencies, and I did make the observation that most of these rating agencies have a Western mindset and not enough acculturated to the realities of developing countries, for example, in emphasizing the S, the social impact. And I think at this point in time, what I've seen is there's an over emphasis on the E, not the environment of the in your vicinity, but I'm really talking about carbon contribution, where Philippine corporations are held to the same standards as companies in developed world, which account for the bigger part of the carbon. Let's see, I probably have only one last chat question that I can ask. Let's see.
Romy?
Yes.
May I, because you raised a question about wages and wage levels earlier, right? And I don't think we've talked about that. And I think that needs to be talked about because, as I shared with the World Bank report, really the quality of jobs is a major issue in the Philippines. Even when we have very high corporate growth, the quality of jobs do not increase as a function of growth, right? And the question there is, and we've been criticized because of our relatively high labor rates, etc. But the challenge for management is really to develop their employees and to institute innovation. Because if the business model is really just about making products cheap and good, but the benefits to the employees are not properly accrued, then it's really a suboptimal model in the long run. Which means companies really need to see employees as sources of innovation so that we can make better products and services that can really compete with the best in the world. Otherwise, our products are merely copycat products, or we market them in volume in huge malls because, you know, Filipinos love cheap and good products. But then we can never escape that business model of just taking advantage of low quality jobs or contingent jobs, but not really harnessing our employees for innovation. And I think that's the road forward. Let's not think of the high wages per se, but think of how to leverage on the talent of our people so that we can have more innovative companies. Otherwise, they will continue to migrate in droves, as we have seen in the last 40 years.
Thank you, Ben. No, I do agree with your general point about need for companies to continue to innovate. But I also would like to echo the point I think made by Anton, that the Philippines has basically missed out on that labor generating manufacturing activity. We've actually missed out. And this is due to failures in other policies, high cost of food, traffic congestion, and so on, that makes living in the Philippines very high. But conglomerates have actually are been paying much better, in the higher than minimum wages, and that has not helped either in creating more jobs. I mean, in the I guess in the perfect competition case, you will hire to the point of the cost of their labor. So so the moment you start putting up wages or putting in place hindrances to labor markets, you will actually reduce your employment. I mean, in general, talking about the principles, but again, at the company level, they really have to weigh all of this altogether. I've talked too much as a moderator. I know Professor Zingales is in a different time zone. We've already imposed so much on him. So unless there are any other pressing points, and maybe I should allow both Professor Zingales and Professor Ben to give some parting words before I close this session. Kindly, Professor.
Just thank you very much for this opportunity. I learned a lot about the Philippines, and I think it's a very interesting issue. So I'm very glad I participated.
Professor Ben?
Yes, I think this is an important conversation. It's much delayed, I must say, but it is an important conversation that we should continue to have. The big business in the Philippines is treated like a black box, and the average citizen does not understand how important it is for them to engage big businesses, especially so that they can serve the common good. And I hope that we can educate the public, especially now that we're trying to encourage more equity investment. We have one of the lowest rate of investment in the capital markets among citizens. We have less than 3% invested compared to more than 30% in Singapore and even 20% in Malaysia. So I think if we just engage everyone to really embrace business as a force for good, then we can really grow in the equitable and shared way that our Constitution envisions. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to more conversations like this.
Thank you, professors, again, and please give, may I lead in giving everybody a very loud virtual applause, and then I send the floor back to Sheila. Thank you, Sheila, for the invitation on my account too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bernardo, for your excellent facilitation of this webinar. And again, thank you to all our speakers for their valuable insights. Please join me in thanking them again by giving them a well-deserved round of applause. Okay. Before we end our virtual event, we have some announcements. The presentations that you heard today can be downloaded from the PIDS website. Just go to the event section, and you may also download the files from the DPRM website. Please help us improve our webinars by answering the survey that will pop on your screen when you leave the meeting room. Your feedback is important to us. And also be updated on our latest knowledge resources and forthcoming events. Just follow us on our website and our social media accounts. And friends, we have 3 more webinars coming up. The next one will be on ethical business this coming Thursday, September 16. Then the last 2 webinars will take place next week. On September 21, we'll talk about the green and inclusive recovery. And on September 23, we'll discuss the topic will be on a robust and healthy workforce. And the closing program will immediately follow after webinar 4. And for more information about this year's DPRM celebration, simply visit the DPRM website at dprm.pids.gov.ph. And it contains everything that you need to know about our celebration this year. And this website will be accessible even after September. We also encourage all of you to use the hashtags that are flashing on the screen when sharing posts about the DPRM on your social media accounts. And finally, we would like to thank all the agencies from the government, private sector, academia, civil society, the business sector, as well as those from the media that joined us today. And you can see the names of these organizations on the screen. We also appreciate the participation of our Facebook viewers and those who follow the live tweets of this webinar via our Twitter page. We look forward to seeing all of you again on September 16, 21, and 23 for the remainder of our APPC webinar series. Thank you and a pleasant day to all of us.